Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. The NBA trade deadline is tomorrow. The question everyone's asking themselves, will the Timberwolves trade Julius Randle? We'll talk about that and more next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I am the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. Happy Timberwolves game day. We'll talk Wolves, Bulls later in the show, but we have to start with, well, it's trade deadline eve. Tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. Central, Thursday, is the NBA trade deadline, and the Timberwolves it's possible they'll do something, right? Like Julius Randle, expiring contract, kind of sort of player option, the whole thing. We'll talk about that next. And ESPN actually mentioned the Wolves as a potential three-team trade match as part of the Jimmy Butler trade. No, not getting Jimmy Butler back to the Twin Cities, but could the Wolves help facilitate the trade? As constructed, it's possible, but I'll talk about why I'm dubious that could happen. But it's possible the Wolves trade Randle. We'll talk about the pros and cons, what they can and can't do next, and lots of other stuff to get to on the show today. We'll talk Rob and Ant lineups. We'll talk Wolves Bulls tonight. It's all upcoming. First, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. You can also watch on YouTube, and you can watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, you can sign up for the Locked On Wolves daily newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. It's one stop for Ultimate Wolves and NBA coverage delivered right to your inbox. Again, sign up for free at LockedOnDaily.com. All right. Trade deadlines tomorrow at 2 p.m. We talked a little bit about this, I guess, 2 weeks ago. I did one show with Andrew Dukowitz. We talked about it last week. I talked about it briefly. The cliff notes for the Wolves are they're pretty hamstrung. They can't aggregate contracts in a trade out because they're over the second apron, meaning their trade has to be a 1-for-1 or they get multiple players back in exchange. Like they've got an open roster spots. They could do a 2-for-1. They could take two guys back and send one guy out. That's the biggest restriction. There's some others there. Of course, they can't really trade any first round picks, at least not anything, in the next few years. Besides the Pistons pick they have, that they're the protected pick that I'm sure they're not going to trade. And there just aren't that many guys on the roster that are tradable. It's certainly not in like a 2-for-1 type situation where they're getting two guys back. So Julius Randle's really the only trade asset. The Wolves theoretically could trade Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Certainly there'd be a market for him, but he's such a valuable player in his contract. And I know he hasn't played great offensively of late, but when the Wolves are at full strength, he's going to be more valuable than he is right now when they're down a couple guys who score a lot of points in Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo. He's being asked to do a little bit too much. I'd be really surprised if they traded Nickeil. Like they're obviously not trading top end guys in terms of salary. Like Julius Randle's the only realistic trade option for Minnesota. But I had kind of said all along, I think I put it between 5 and 10% the Wolves would make a deal. I still kind of think that's true. But ESPN had an interesting piece that they put out. This was was it on Tuesday? Yeah, it was Tuesday morning, where they were trying to find a place for Jimmy Butler to go. And there was a proposed 3-team deal by, I think it was Andre Snellings at ESPN, that proposed Jimmy Butler goes to the Nuggets and the Wolves would be the third team that would facilitate the trade. Now, as constructed, according to a couple of trade machines that I consulted, it's close to working, not quite as he lays it out, but close enough that it's worth talking about, like at least financially. In this deal, and again, this is just a fake trade that ESPN put together that mentioned the Timberwolves. And I should also say that one of the motivations for the Wolves to trade Randle would be to gain some cost certainty for the future, right? Because Julius Randle has that player option for the offseason. So he could opt out, and then you've got that cap space, but he might opt in, and then you're stuck. And it's going to be hard, really impossible to bring back both Naz Reid and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Naz also has a player option. He's obviously going to opt out because he's going to get another big raise. Nickeil is going to get a big raise in free agency as well. So you could keep maybe one of those guys, maybe, but maybe neither of them if Julius Randle does not opt out. So the idea here is you trade Randle, setting aside what he does or doesn't give you this year, which is silly to set aside, but it's set aside for now. And then at least you know what's going to happen this offseason. If you bring back guys that are expiring, or if you bring back guys that they're under contract for next year, but at least you're not in limbo from a player option salary cap standpoint for next year. You know that you do or don't have the space. In terms of this year's production, we'll talk about lineups here in a second, but there's certainly the Julius Randle fit's been clunky, as many, including myself, thought it might be way back in late September when we first discussed it after the trade. But of course, recently, right before the groin injury, Julius Randle was playing better. And in the 2 games since his injury, the Wolves have struggled. Now, the overall lineup data would suggest, and we'll talk about this in a moment, Rudy Gobert plays much better with Reid than he does with Julius Randle. Not surprising. So there's an argument to be made that, hey, this may actually make them better this year, may make them better next year. But there's also, again, counterpoint, rocking the boat for a team that, I know they're not having a great season, but they're still 4 games above 500, in position to get out of the play-in in the West. They're starting to play better. The last 2 bad losses notwithstanding, things have been trending in the upward direction. They played the most close games in the NBA. Eventually they'll get some luck there. Their Pythagorean win-loss percentage based on their point differential and the close games they've been in is 3 games better than, I think they're 27 and 23, and they should be 30 and 20 or something like that. Somewhere in that neighborhood. They're 3 games worse than they should be. Yes, there's late game execution issues, but there's also some flukiness involved, right? So that's the counterpoint, which is where I think the Wolves will land. I think they'll say, you know what? Let's not rock the boat for the second time in 5 months or whatever it's been. Yeah, 5-ish months since the trade in September. Let's just stand pat. Let's see what we can do this year. But let's talk about this trade at ESPN. It's intriguing. I don't think it happens. According to this fake trade at ESPN, is Jimmy Butler goes to the Nuggets with Josh Richardson. Of course, both players coming from Miami. Miami gets Michael Porter Jr., Zeke Naji, and Vlatko Kenkar from Denver. Now, according to the trade machine, I think it was the Fanspo trade machine, the Nuggets would then be $2 million over. So you take out Kenkar, it would still work, but whatever. So according to this, Porter, Naji, and Kenkar, and Julius Randle from Minnesota would go to Miami. And the Miami Heat were allegedly at some point interested in Julius Randle recently. I think there was even a report they talked to the Wolves about Randle at some point. The Wolves would get from the Heat Duncan Robinson and Haywood Highsmith, and from the Nuggets, Russell Westbrook. Now, I'm going to set aside my how much I don't enjoy watching Russell Westbrook play for the moment. I actually don't think this trade is terrible value for Minnesota. I really don't. What happens? Well, you move Naz Reid into the starting lineup next to Rudy Gobert. Russell Westbrook / Rob Dillingham. That's one reason why I wouldn't do it, I guess, is that those 2 guys together. Not I guess. I wouldn't do it for that reason, in part due to the Westbrook Dillingham thing. But if we think that Chris Finch doesn't want to coach a player of I'm jumping a couple of conclusions here. But if Chris Finch is worried about Dillingham down the stretch of the season in the playoffs, et cetera, I don't know that Westbrook should necessarily make him feel that much better. I get that he's a lot older, but offensively, Dillingham's a more efficient offensive player, but the style of play, the breakneck speed, the recklessness at times, Westbrook's not going to make Chris Finch feel much better. But you're also getting Haywood Highsmith, who's a solid 3-and-D player. There's similarities to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, at least what he provides from a player profile standpoint, even if it looks a little different. And then Duncan Robinson, who's been one of the best shooters in the league for the last several years. He's 38% this year from 3. He was just a shade under 40% last year. Earlier in his career, he broke 40% twice in terms of 3-point shooting percentage. So you'd be adding in essentially 3 rotation guys. So you're sending out 1 rotation guy and you're getting 3 back in this situation. Yes, that would be a 3-for-1. The Wolves would have to waive somebody to eat some money. Unfortunately, it's probably Joe Ingles. I don't really know if there's another option unless it's Luka Garza. But either way, you're eating money by waiving somebody. So you're getting 3 rotation guys back. It's hard to argue against that. Now, is Julius Randle better than all 3 of those players? Yes. Julius Randle's no question. He's got his issues, but he's a better player than the 3 guys you're acquiring. But is it better to have the 3 rotation guys? I mean, it's in some ways a version of what the Wolves did in September. They traded out the best player in the trading, Karl Anthony Towns. They got back 2 rotation guys in Randle and DiVincenzo. Now you take Randle, you trade him out, you get 3 rotation guys. And now you built back up a rotation of 9 guys you feel really good about, and Dillingham's back out of the rotation. Like, that's the argument for this deal. And then there's the cost certainty thing. However, both Duncan Robinson and Haywood Highsmith each have a year left on their deal. So if you make this trade, I don't think Westbrook does too, but I believe it's a minimum contract. All that to say, you're not helping yourself for the summer, but at least you know that, to the point I made earlier. You know you've got these guys under contract next year. Obviously, you can make trades at that point if you can get under the second apron. So there's some flexibility. If you wanted to turn around and dump Duncan Robinson somewhere, he makes like $19 million next year, fine. Like, you can make that work. But the rotation immediately would be deeper. I don't think the Wolves do it because I think it would net out pretty similar to where they're at now. It might help them a little bit, but the team would look completely different. And as we saw with the initial trade, the Randle DiVincenzo acquisitions, the Wolves there's been a big learning curve. They're 50 games in, and this thing still isn't figured out. And that's the thing with deadline deals is, I guess the argument would be, I mean, they're in 7th in the West now. Like, are they going to be that much worse if you make this trade and then you get your cost certainty, et cetera? So there's an argument to be made for it. And of the trades that could happen, this makes a lot more sense to me than some of the other stuff that I've seen floated out there. Getting 3 rotation guys back, getting a 3-and-D guy in Haywood Highsmith, getting a knockdown shooter in Duncan Robinson, who's obviously doesn't help you defensively, we'll say it that way, who's very expensive, but also he's going to be more tradable potentially than Julius Randle next year as a true expiring. But I don't know. So that's out there. I don't think the Wolves would do that deal. I don't think I would do that deal. However, if they did it, I wouldn't get too worked up about it because it would mean more Nas with Rudy, which we'll talk about in a moment. It would mean a deeper bench unit that Chris Finch would have to trust. The downside is you got to watch Russell Westbrook play basketball. He's a Hall of Famer. I get it. But the 36-year-old version of Russell Westbrook, or at least the last 4 years version of Russell Westbrook, ever since he made that, I guess his last All-Star team was in Houston. That was also a bit rough, but really post OKC Russ is not for me. But he's been okay for Denver this year. So as much as it's not aesthetically pleasing, you could say the same about Julius Randle in some ways. But all that to say, I don't think this deal happens. But Jimmy Butler's he's going to get traded. So we'll see. We'll see. I want to talk some rotation stuff next, which includes the Julius, Nas, Rudy conversation, but also Ant and Rob Dillingham. I want to spend some time on that. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Game Time. Looking for tickets to your next big event? Whether it's a concert, a comedy show, or a sports game, finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache. But with Game Time Picks, it's never been easier. Let me tell you how it works. With Game Time Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. I've been using Game Time Picks for a while now, and here's why I love it. The curated deals make it super simple to find great tickets at a great price. No more sifting through thousands of options. You can grab a super deal for prime seats. And trust me, you won't believe the value. They're absolute steals all the time. The seat view feature is also a game changer. Before you even hit buy, you can see exactly what your seat will look like in the venue. And it's, trust me, extremely reassuring. The best part is that you're covered with Game Time's lowest price guarantee. If you find a better deal somewhere else, they'll refund 110% of the difference. Plus, your tickets are guaranteed to be delivered on time with easy cancellation options if something comes up. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right. Let's talk a little bit about Timberwolves lineups. We could start with the Rudy thing, or really more accurately, the Julius Randle thing. This was actually pointed out in the ESPN article about I should mention it's an ESPN Insider article behind the paywall about the Butler to Denver in a 9-player 3-team deal article. It points out something we've talked about on the show, but I'll just read it from here. This is per Basketball Reference, not cleaning the glass, so I usually use. So per the ESPN article, per Basketball Reference, the two most common 5-man units on the Wolves feature Randle and Gobert together. Both units have negative point differentials. Barely, but they're negative. Meanwhile, the 4 units that feature Gobert and Reid together that have played more than 50 minutes have a positive point differential, an average plus 18.8 points per 100 possessions in just over 300 minutes. So the sample size is much smaller, but it's a much more successful pairing. Part of that is, well, there's a lot of reasons for it. The biggest thing is obviously the spacing and Nas attacking off the dribble. The ball movement is better. And of course, the 3-point shooting, it's not comparable. Like Julius can shoot the 3, but Nas Reid can can really shoot the 3. That's the biggest difference. So a trade like the one we just talked about is positive because it means Nas becomes a member of the starting lineup. And then your bench depth becomes Russ and or Rob Dillingham as your offense off the bench. You lose your front court offense off the bench. Like now there is no big man depth, and that's the biggest issue. Highsmith's great. Duncan Robinson's fine, but he's more of a 3. And now you've got Jaden McDaniels going to have to play the 4 with regularity. Whether that's Duncan Robinson cycling in, as your first or second sub, and then Nas comes back with the bench unit as the 4, but he's also your backup 5, right? With no Julius Randle, like that either means Luka Garza is getting more minutes, which a week ago I would have felt better about than I would after the last 2 games. So it helps your depth overall, but now you've got a glut of guys that are playing the 1 through 3 because you're adding Highsmith and you're adding Duncan Robinson to a team with Nikhil, a team with obviously Ant and Jaden. So McDaniels would have to play the 4. Duncan Robinson might have to play the 4. You don't really want that. So like those are all reasons why it's a bit scary, but the plus side would be Nas with Rudy. We've seen success to that. Anthony Edwards with Rob Dillingham, we've done this the last couple of weeks. I've talked about this, and it continues to be a thing. Look at it this way. Like, it's still been limited possessions, limited minutes, and Ant didn't play Saturday. So, like, we're still, the data we have on Rob and Ant playing together is still very limited. So, I want to be very clear about that. This season, though, Anthony Edwards on the floor without Rob Dillingham. So, Timberwolves lineups with Ant and no Rob, which is like almost 3,400 possessions. It's a lot because Rob Dillingham hasn't played a lot until recently. They're a plus 3.5 net per 100 possessions. So Ant with no Rob. That's a 71st percentile unit. Now, in a much smaller sample, I can't be any more clear about this. That's almost 3,400 possessions. I'm now going to talk 215 possessions of Rob Dillingham and Anthony Edwards together. I still think it's worth talking about for reasons I'll explain that I have previously, and I'll reiterate here. They're a plus 26.5 per 100 possessions. So 23.5 points or 23 points better. That's a 100th percentile unit, a 100th percentile offensive unit, and a 90th percentile defensive unit. Why? Well, I made this point on the postgame pod Monday too, after the Wolves' most recent disappointing loss to the shorthanded Sacramento Kings on, did I say on Monday? It would have been Tuesday's pod after Monday night's game. There are only 4 guys in the Timberwolves that can get their own shot, create their own offense, and in turn, potentially create for others. Anthony Edwards, obviously. Then your next tier is Julius Randle, probably by himself. Then after that, it's Nas Reid and Rob Dillingham. Those are the only other guys on the roster that can score for themselves. So like Saturday when Ant was out and Julius Randle was out and Nas went out with an injury after playing 20 minutes, that meant it was only Rob Dillingham. And so it killed the Wolves when Dillingham did not see the floor down the stretch. There was nobody that was creating offense. The flow wasn't there. Nobody else is creating off the dribble. And then against, say, the Kings game, when they're blitzing and pick and roll, or they're just putting 2 on the ball as soon as Ant crosses the timeline, if there's nobody that really scares the defense, when they get into rotation, they're like, all right, well, if Jaden hits in a corner 3, if he hits a floater from 14 feet, a weird push shot leaner, we'll live with that. If Mike Conley actually puts the ball on the deck and shoots a layup, we'll live with that. If Rudy Gobert gets a lob, we'd rather him not, but he doesn't have the best hands, and these guys aren't great lob throwers, and we'll live with that. We just don't want Anthony Edwards to beat us. But if Rob Dillingham's on the floor, or if Naz Reid's on the floor, and I recognize he was at the end of the Kings game, and Naz did a ton of his damage early and overall had a great game. But you have to have another one of those guys on the floor. Usually it's Julius Randle, but Rob Dillingham gives you that different dynamic where he can catch and shoot. He can also shoot off the dribble. He can shoot step backs. He can get into the paint. He can get his head and shoulders past you and then throw a lob, or then, kick it to the opposite corner for, and he makes mistakes. Like he had that lob that didn't get converted to Naz that ultimately I think was like the last play before he got pulled by Chris Finch and didn't come back in the fourth quarter against the Kings. But the threat of Dillingham being able to do other stuff helps open things up for Ant and vice versa. I understand the sample size is drastic, but I believe that the more we see Anthony Edwards and Rob Dillingham play together, the better the Timberwolves offense will look. I just think they complement each other extremely well. And yeah, there's defensive concerns, but the offense is a bigger concern right now. And Dillingham's always going to be on the floor with guys. He's going to be on the floor with two of Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Jaden McDaniels almost all the time. Throw in Dante DiVincenzo if you want another strong perimeter defender. So I think it's all about finding ways to make Anthony Edwards more effective offensively, to allow him to get off the ball, to allow him to make defenses pay by making the right read. And we've seen that. He struggled in the Kings game. The Kings did a good job, and Ant just didn't always think two steps ahead. And I think overall we've seen improvement in that area, but teams will think twice before doubling off of Rob Dillingham, or even if Rob and Naz are on the floor together, sending yourself into rotation as a defense would be a scary prospect, I think. But if it's just Ant with Mike Conley and Jaden McDaniels and Rudy Gobert, okay, it's less scary, a lot less scary. And teams are going to continue to completely load up on Anthony Edwards. All right, let's talk about Wolves Bulls. This is a new look Chicago Bulls team. We'll talk about what happened the last time the Wolves played the Bulls, and we'll look at the line for this one too. It's kind of crazy. We'll do all that here next. Today's show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are some of your relationship green flags? We often hear about the red flags we should avoid, but what if we focus more on identifying the positive signs in our relationships, those green flags? If you're not sure what they look like, therapy can help you identify them, actively practice them, and even embody that green flag energy yourself. Whether you're dating, married, building a friendship, or just working on yourself, therapy can help you form relationships that love you back. Therapy helps you develop healthy boundaries and improves your communication skills. It empowers you to set clear expectations and express your needs in relationships. Therapy provides tools for managing conflict in ways that strengthen your connections rather than break them down. BetterHelp makes it easy by offering online therapy with over 30,000 licensed therapists to choose from. And if you need to switch therapists, you can do so at no extra cost. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, Wolves Bulls tonight at Target Center. Now, the Wolves, of course, much has been made of their home record, and rightfully so, because they've been awful at home. They're actually 12-12 now at Target Center, which is inexcusable. There's a lot of stuff floating around out there why that might be. I think Mike Conley said something about players having infants, children. I don't want to dig into that too much, but that's a legit thing. I mean, they're people too. The difference is, like, if you go to your work and sit at a desk all day and you're just a little bit out of it, less people are going to notice. And I get that, to the average person, playing basketball may sound easier, but obviously they get paid a lot more to do it than you or I to do what we do. But that's a real thing. That can be true. And we can, it's not like a real excuse, but it's a factor that you have to consider when you're evaluating this. The Wolves are clearly, Chris Finch had some comments about discussing their routines at home, and like, who knows if it's like report time changing or shoot around time changing or whatever that looks like for the Wolves, they've got to evaluate some stuff. They've now lost 2 in a row to games they should 2 games in a row to teams they should not have lost to at home, and they're at 500. And you don't get to where you're going to go if you're where you want to go if you're not much better than that at home, like they were last year. So they're actually, the Wolves are, according to FanDuel, 11.5-point favorites against the Chicago Bulls on Wednesday night. A big reason why is because of the trade the Bulls just pulled off, sending out Zach LaVine. So we know there's no Zach LaVine. There's also injuries for the Bulls. We can look at let's see, I believe I've got the actual injury report here. Where'd it go? There's a bunch of guys out. Let's see. Last time out, Torrey Craig did not play. They just got a bunch of guys in trades that are not supposed to play until the weekend. So like, I don't know, all the guys that got in the trade, the report is they're not going to play until Saturday. So they're not going to play at Target Center Wednesday night. You've also got other rotation guys like Taylor Horton Tucker is an important rotation guy for them. He is doubtful to play. Among other guys that are hurt, Jalen Smith is questionable due to an illness. So you go on down. Well, yeah, okay. I got thrown out for a second there. I was like, I did a double take. I was like, wait a minute. Yeah, Jalen Smith is questionable due to an illness, so he's not going to play, or he likely won't play. He didn't play on Tuesday. This is a depleted Bulls team. Now, the Wizards were a bad team against the depleted Wolves team. The Wolves lost on Saturday. The Kings were depleted is a strong word. They still had DeMar DeRozan and Domantas Sabonis, but a team that was missing previously their best player in De'Aaron Fox and had been through a lot, was on this road trip, tail end on the road for 2 weeks, like another winnable game for Minnesota. The last time the Wolves played the Bulls was back in early November, November 7th to be exact. The Wolves won by 26 points in Chicago. Nikola Vucevic led the way for them at the time. He had 25 and 5 rebounds, 25 points, 5 rebounds. Kobe White had 24 and 8. He always seems to play well against the Timberwolves. This team is just not, the depth is not there. The high-end talent is not there in LaVine. This is a Bulls team that the Timberwolves should not struggle against. But hey, I said that before the Wizards game. I thought they would win the Kings game, although that's obviously still a talented team. But this Chicago Bulls team right now is 10th in the Eastern Conference. They're 22 and 29. They're a game above the Philadelphia 76ers in the East. And you go down like what they do well. Well, there's not a lot that they do well on really either side of the floor. On offense, they shoot a lot of threes and they make a lot of threes. That changes with no Zach LaVine. That's the biggest concern. Generally, they play fast, which is something that the Wolves need to look out for. That's something the Wolves have struggled with at times. They get sucked into playing too fast against teams that they shouldn't play fast with. This is a good example of that, right? They don't need a higher variance type game. And that's not, they don't want to get into a Kobe White track meet. That's just not a winning strategy for Minnesota against a team like Chicago. On the other end of the floor, the Bulls do not force turnovers, which is good for the Wolves. And they don't foul. So the Wolves need to just solid ball movement, get to their shots. Something we saw in each of the last 2 games is they just missed open shots. That's going to be important in this game, is knocking down the open shots that they're able to generate with their offense. And then not worrying about crashing the glass for offensive rebounds. They actually offensive rebounded well on Monday against the Kings, but I wouldn't make that a focus of this game. When these two teams, again, looks different, although LaVine didn't play in that game, I should point out. The Timberwolves won that game because they made their open shots. That was really the biggest reason. It was a high-scoring game. The Timberwolves did really well points in the paint wise, as they should, against a team that's just really got Vucevic, and Patrick Williams isn't exactly a rim protector. Like, there's not much else down there to slow you down in the paint, and that's the area the Wolves did really well in. And otherwise, it was a fairly evenly matched game, like same amount of turnovers, roughly the same number of free throws. It was being able to take advantage in the open floor when you do get turnovers, knock down the open 3-point attempts, and score points in the paint. Make your free throws. The Bulls missed 5 free throws. The Wolves didn't miss any last game. Minnesota in that game, I said earlier they won by 26. They actually won by 16. But they just played a solid game. Anthony Edwards had 33 points in that game. There's nobody defensively that's going to slow him down individually. So Anthony Edwards should have, there's no reason he shouldn't have a big game. He was a bit off on Monday coming back from the illness. So hopefully he's feeling better come Wednesday night. Of course, this game is made even more important by the fact it's a home game coming off 2 straight losses. But Thursday night, you got to play the Houston Rockets on short rest, back-to-back situation. At least you're at home, but that's a tough one. You got to beat the Bulls. You can't lose 3 in a row and then go into the Rockets on a back-to-back. It's just not an option. And maybe that desperation is factored into that 11.5-point line over at FanDuel. Of course, we'll have the live postcast over at Locked On Sports Minnesota after the game on YouTube, and then that audio will be right here at Locked On Wolves if you can't watch live. I'll be back on Thursday with the postgame pod. We'll talk about what happened in Wolves Bulls. We'll peek ahead to Wolves Rockets on Thursday night, and we'll get you ready for the weekend then as well, because then after Wolves Rockets, well, actually the trade deadline's Thursday too. So who knows? Whatever happens Wednesday could throw things off. We'll always add an extra pod in there if the Wolves do something for sure. So stay tuned just in case. You never know. 2 p.m. Thursday. Anything can happen between now and then. I did the Kings preview on Sunday afternoon, and I said something about, the Fox thing is hanging over the Kings' head, and then right after it posted, I think late Sunday or Sunday afternoon is when the Fox trade happened. So who knows? All right. That's all we got for you today on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. A reminder, you can subscribe to the Locked On Wolves newsletter. One stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free at LockedOnDaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Of course, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.